Hello, everyone. I'm going to say good afternoon and good evening because I know we have people from all over the United States, as well as some of our colleagues and friends in South Africa. So, welcome to Dismantling Injustice, an anti-racist approach to supporting incarcerated survivors. My name is Cynthia Totten. I'm the Deputy Executive Director at Just Detention International. My pronouns are she, her. JDI, as we call Just Detention International, is a health and human rights organization that works to end sexual abuse in all forms of detention. To learn more about what we do at JDI, please visit our website, which will be linked in the chat. Before we get started, I want to mention that we have Spanish and ASL interpretation available today. You'll see at the bottom of your screen a little globe, and if you click on that, you should see an option for English, Spanish, or ASL. And the session is also being recorded. Now, as we go along, we'll have some opportunities for you to say hi or comment, ask questions, or put some finger snaps in the chat if you like what you're hearing throughout the event. You can post questions in the Q&A box. And right now, we just welcome you to say hi and tell us where you're tuning in from in the chat box. And again, you'll be able to continue to post comments and reactions there throughout the event. And I see people are starting to get active in the chat, which is very exciting. Welcome, Beverly, and welcome, everyone. So this event is the second in a series of 3 virtual sessions that JDI has been doing, looking at the state of the movement to end sexual abuse behind bars. We began the series last week with a really lively and fun open house that gave folks an inside look at JDI's work to end prisoner rape and support survivors. Now, today, we're turning our attention to a critical facet of how we do this work: anti-racism within the movement to end sexual abuse in detention. So to be specific, anti-racism is the practice of actively identifying and opposing racism. It is work that is inseparable from fighting for the rights of incarcerated people, and it must also be central to anti-sexual violence efforts. In the US criminal legal system, data shows that at every phase, whether you're talking about aggressive stop and frisk practices and traffic stops, the likelihood of being released or detained pre-trial, or harsh prison sentences, Black people are the most greatly impacted. And if we narrow the lens down to incarceration specifically, what we see is that Black men make up almost 40% of the prison and jail populations in this country. And that is in spite of the fact that they make up just 13% of the overall US population. Putting that another way, Black men are incarcerated at a rate that is 5 times that of white men. So take that in for a second. Black women, meanwhile, make up about 30% or so of the people in women's prisons. And just to add one more piece of data, and then I'm going to stop talking about numbers and talk more about people and issues. In states including Louisiana, Georgia, Mississippi, and Maryland, where I live, about 70% of incarcerated people who are serving life sentences are Black. So these data all point to the systemic racism that pervades our law enforcement and criminal legal systems. And as we think more deeply about inequality and anti-Black racism, we're thinking about where the work to end sexual abuse in detention dovetails with abolition and ending mass incarceration. So I'm throwing around some terms that may sound jargony. Because the term abolition gets thrown around so much, let me take a second and define what we're talking about. Our criminal legal system focuses on punishing people for wrongs with little concern for the needs of the particular person who committed the harm or the loss that the victim of that harm or that crime has suffered, and what sort of remedies might actually help the victim to begin to heal. This lock-em-up approach is a signature aspect of what is termed the prison industrial complex, whereby politicians, corporations, and often rural economies benefit financially and otherwise from a very profit-driven system. The abolitionist response, by contrast, seeks to restore both the person who committed the harm and the victim to full humanity, to lives of integrity and dignity in the community. One of the steps in getting there is to eliminate or greatly reduce the number of prisons and jails that we see around the country and replace them and the staggeringly large budgets that fund them with the resources that are needed for people and communities to heal and thrive. And I want to pause right here and just acknowledge the work of the Prison Research Education Action Project, which authored the book Instead of Prisons, a Handbook for Abolitionists. It's a really useful resource, and I think we're going to put the link to that in the chat. So these efforts are critically important when you consider the more than 1.8 million people who are currently held in more than 1,500 state and federal prisons, 3,000 local jails, 1,300 juvenile detention facilities, 140 immigration detention facilities, and 80 Indian country jails all over the country. These people inside facing all manner of human rights violations, including sexual abuse, on a routine basis. And the people who bear the brunt of the crisis that we're fighting at JDI, the crisis of sexual abuse in detention, are people of color. Black people in prisons and jails, like Black youth in juvenile detention, face higher rates of staff abuse than do white people. What's more, Black people in prison face disproportionate levels of punishment. A New York Times study from just a couple years ago found that Black people in New York State prisons were 5 times more likely to be punished than white people for breaking prison rules. And of course, all of that punishment means more time in solitary confinement and longer stints in prison. JDI's foundational principle will always be that rape is not part of the penalty, meaning that as long as there are prisons and jails, we will fight to make sure that those who are inside are safe. So that brings us to our conversation today. Today, we are going to discuss the unique challenges incarcerated survivors of color face, how we can support this population while working towards ending mass incarceration, and what folks in the community can do to further this movement. So I would like to welcome an incredible panel of experts today who are joining me. First, Dr. Indira Henard, who is the Executive Director of the DC Rape Crisis Center. Hey, Indira. And the DC Rape Crisis Center, again, right here where I'm living, right across the border from DC and Maryland. The DC Rape Crisis Center is the first rape crisis center that was ever established in this country, a very, very important organization. We're also joined by Andrea James, who is the founder and executive director of the National Council for Incarcerated and Formerly Incarcerated Women and Girls. Hey, Andrea. Andrea is also the author of Upper Bunkies Unite and Other Thoughts on the Politics of Mass Incarceration. And finally, we have with us Kai Peterson. Kai is a member of JDI's Survivor Council. He is the founder and CEO of Freedom Overground. Hey, Kai, which is an organization that works to ensure the safety and dignity of incarcerated and formerly incarcerated trans and gender nonconforming people. I've had a lot of opportunity to work side by side with Kai doing advocacy, and just love working with you, Kai, as a fellow warrior in this movement to end sexual abuse in detention. So we're so thrilled to have the three of you here with us today. And before we jump in, I want to remind folks in the audience that you can feel free to drop any questions that you might have in the Q&A box or in the chat, and we will try to get to them during our Q&A session. So let's jump in. So to start off, Indira, I want to talk to you first and ask you, from the perspective of someone who provides direct services to survivors of sexual abuse, why is it important that we talk about racism and specifically anti-Blackness?
Yeah, thank you so much, Cynthia, for that question. It's great to be with you all and great to be with my fellow panelists. I think first and foremost, we have to understand that all forms of oppression are connected. There is not a walk of life that sexual violence does not impact. We know that sexual violence disproportionately impacts Black people. We know that over 60% of Black women have been sexually violated at some point in their life. So when we're looking at mass incarceration, we know that the majority of folks who are incarcerated most likely have experienced some sort of sexual trauma. And so we really have to be mindful of the ways in which systemic barriers impact Black women who are incarcerated from healing and finding restorative justice. I think it's also important to note that we also need to think about centering humanity, right? So we know that safety is an issue in jail. We know that psychological safety is an issue in jail. We know that retaliation is real. And when someone is sexually assaulted in jail, what does that look like in real time in terms of getting support and resources? When my advocates show up at the hospital in DC and someone is coming from the Department of Corrections, they're coming in handcuffs. When they have to get an exam, they have to get an exam in handcuffs. That's inhumane, right? So, really thinking about the ways in which all forms of oppression are connected. And as we're talking about this conversation, we really have to center the voice of survivors and let them be the GPS in which we follow our direction from.
Yeah, thank you, Indira. I love that you started off the conversation with that reminder that survivors have to be at the center, not only of kind of the efforts, but the work itself, right? Leading the work. And that is so important to always have that in mind. Andrea, you are a proud abolitionist and someone who is renowned for your expertise around abolition. When we're discussing this movement to end sexual abuse behind bars, why is it so important to talk about abolition at the same time?
Well, I thank you, and thank you for inviting me, and thank you to Kai, and thank you to Indira for the opportunity to sit on this panel with them, both experts in this conversation. I am an abolitionist, and the fact that I'm a formerly incarcerated woman, a woman who has lived in a prison with a couple of thousand other women at the time in the federal prison for women in Danbury, Connecticut. Um, it's sexual abuse in prison, rape of women in prison is one of the underlying reasons why we sat in that prison in 2010, organized ourselves as incarcerated women in 2010, where there was this significant uptick in the dialogue around the need to end mass incarceration. And we heard very little about us. Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, came out. It was just lit a fire under people in this country who normally don't pay attention to the issue of incarceration of anybody for any reason. And she really helped us to see from all of the things that we know that mass incarceration is the new Jim Crow, from slavery to mass incarceration and so forth. But again, we heard very little about women. And we were women sitting in a prison where there was sexual abuse happening in the prison. It happens in every single woman's prison and jail in the country. And so abolition is not, some woo-woo concept. Abolition, and we are abolitionists because we have poured into participatory research processes led by the most directly affected women in this country who have the direct experience of being in a prison, living in a prison, surviving in a prison, but also women and girls who support, love, and take care of us and our children while we are incarcerated. And I bring that point up because for us, we really didn't have the term abolition. Honestly, we were learning from Angela Davis, of course, from the Ruth Wilson Gilmore, from the books that were coming into the prison. But we had heard of the term, but we became abolitionists because we had the experience that we knew was a failed experiment in this country called the prisons and jails. And we know that a woman will never be safe or fully be able to heal or transform her life in one of these places, and that we wanted to come up with better ideas, better pathways towards healthy, thriving people and communities, because we know for sure that police and prisons do not create that. And so we learned more and more as we could while in that prison and organized ourselves to do this work as each one of us slowly came out. And we were determined to not be afraid, because back then abolition was a dirty word. You couldn't really just loudly pronounce you're an abolitionist. We were told by funders way back when we had nothing that we would never get funding because we were proclaimed abolitionists. But we know for sure that abolition is about building healthy, thriving people and shifting resources into creating healthy, thriving communities, because that's the key to stopping the harm, addressing the harm, getting to the underlying causes of the harm. It's not about people not being held accountable. If you harm somebody, you will be held accountable. It's about how we do that, because it is completely ineffective to put people into more trauma in places called prisons and jails than it is to keep people in community and to come up with what our beloved and beloved Kathy Boudin led us through very difficult, challenging participatory research projects led by women who had caused significant harm, murder, and so forth, to not be afraid to dive deeply into these issues. What were the causes? What were the underlying issues? And how do we move forward to stop the harm? Because prisons are not that environment. Whether they're brand new, shiny places, it's the culture of incarceration that is not going to change. And we need to come up with some other way. And abolition gives us the tools to create that other way.
Yeah, thank you, Andrea. That was really powerfully said. And I want to thank you specifically for sharing about your experience, your lived experience as someone who's formerly incarcerated, and also, I'll note, a former criminal defense attorney. So you have quite a lot of experience on these issues. And also, thank you for lifting up the need to get at the underlying causes of harm. And we know that this current criminal legal system does not do that, right? It kind of looks at the surface and puts, sort of a, kind of puts a dagger, right on the surface instead of kind of getting down below and seeing what's really going on. And what you were saying made me think about Mariam Kaba, who's just another wonderful leader in this work, and something that she had said. She said, my own open letter to the anti-rape movement, written in 2020, would point out that prisons and policing abuse and violate people by design. Their dynamics mirror interpersonal, domestic, and sexual violence. And so, yeah, absolutely. So Kai, let's come on over to you. You come to this work with so much firsthand experience of the injustice of the carceral system. And as someone who has done so much tremendous advocacy with us here at JDI and on your own through your organization, Freedom Overground, how did you find the courage to become an advocate? Why is it important to you to tell your story?
Thank you, Cynthia. I think for me, it's a really long story, but I'm gonna make it short. So I was incarcerated in 2011. I was sexually assaulted, and then I was sent to jail, and then from jail I was transferred to a prison, to a female's detention center. So during that time, I didn't know much about anything, abolition, any of this good stuff that's going on now. So I was just lost and trying to find my way. And it was things that kept happening inside of in that institution. And I had no help from anyone on the outside. And then one day I get a call to go up to, if I'm not mistaken, I think it was the captain's office at the time. And during that, that call up, I'm like, okay, well, am I in trouble? What did I do? Because it was random. So I get called up to the captain's office, and there I meet Linda McFarland from JDI. She's actually there doing a pre-audit. And, I walk into this room, and I'm not really trying to talk to anybody. I don't have the attitude like, well, okay, yeah, let me tell them what's going on. Because when I walk in, I'm like, you know what? This person is on their side. I don't care what they said, because they gave me a little, don't say too much when you go in there type thing before I get in there and meet her. But walking into that room and actually having a conversation with Linda, like, it changed the way that I viewed everything inside of that prison within myself, because her being a complete stranger to me and caring enough to ask things that are going on me, wanting me to feel comfortable and letting me know that if anything is going on, let her know, because it is a way that things should be done. And I have rights, even though I was in that prison. And I told her, I said, well, on my way coming up here, the officer told me that, because my pants were down, because I lost a little bit of weight at the time, my pants were kind of sagging a little bit. So the officer said, someone should teach me that I'm a woman. So I told that to Linda, and I don't know what she said to that officer after our meeting. But the next time that I saw her, I was able to tell her that, I don't know what you said to him, but whatever it was, he came back and he apologized. And I never had any issues with him after that initial interaction with him and Linda, me having to tell her. But it came from that outside help and her asking me what it was I needed. And I was like, you know what? That's what I'm going to do. And that's what really made me push to get Freedom Overground started.
Wow, that's amazing. Thank you for sharing. So you were talking about Linda McFarland, who's our executive director at JDI. And it's funny because Linda also talks about, she shares that story often of meeting you that first time. I think as much as you were moved by that meeting, she was as well. And I think she knew then, and in those early days where you guys, stayed in touch, because I think at that time you began to write to JDI, that there was something really powerful, in you that was gonna, it was just a matter of you having the space and the opportunity to be able to sort of take up the fight yourself. So thank you for that. Did you want to say a little bit more? I don't know if I cut you off in terms of like your transition into becoming, the advocate and starting Freedom Overground.
Okay. I won't take up too much time. So with starting Freedom Overground, it was a need that I saw from inside of the prison. It was a lot of us just not having access to things that we needed just to survive. Just basic things, from personal hygiene to medical, getting the medical help that we needed. So for me, and seeing that, okay, I've been going through this for X amount of years and it's still not getting any better. I complain, I talk to him, nothing happens. So at the time, me and my partner, Pinky Shear, I would write out to her and I'm like, hey, this is going on. So she would go all of the research, she would find all of the information and send it back into me. So it started from her sending me that information for me to file my medical complaints, for me to write my appeals in to prison or to agency. That people started asking questions. It was like, hey, help. So that was just one of the things that just made our little brainchild into what it is today. It's out of me seeing the good, me and her seeing the good, and then definitely talking to Linda and then seeing the need from other people that need help, but didn't know.
Thank you, Kai. Yeah, we had a little trouble hearing you towards the end, but I know what you were sharing was some about your partner, Pinky Shear, and how when you were inside, she was involved in advocating for you and you guys were working together. And that was kind of the laying the foundation for Freedom Overground. And it feels to me like, you know, those early experiences inside and the way that you were treated and the work that you're doing now on behalf of, in particular, right, because you've done some really fierce advocacy on behalf of Black transgender people who are incarcerated, Black trans men in particular, that you are someone who always recognized that this movement is an intersectional movement, right? This isn't just, you know, something about Black people or women or trans people or, you know, cis people, but this is something where all of those layers of identity are really can be sites of oppression. And so when we come to address the oppression, we have to do so with our whole selves and kind of addressing all of those various pieces of who we are and the ways in which we're attacked for being who we are. As you described in the story of the, you know, corrections officials who so horribly made that comment to you about, you know, needing to know that you're a woman because of the way that your pants were, you know, were on you. So thank you for sharing that. So I want to move on to a little bit of a bigger picture question and welcome any or all three of you to chime in around this. How do you see the issue of sexual abuse in detention fitting into this broader anti-racism movement?
Yeah, I mean, I think first and foremost, you know, as long as we've been talking about sexual violence, we still have a long way to go in terms of people really understanding what sexual violence is and how it sits on a spectrum. So language is important. Words are important. Being precise is important. And I say that to say is that you cannot dismantle and or disrupt a problem if you don't know what the problem is, if you don't understand the definition of the problem. And so I think, you know, it's really important that we first go back to the basics. And I think we have to do a lot of psychoeducation, which is what a lot of rape crisis centers do. But I think we also have to be mindful that we just aren't focused on the individuals who are incarcerated. We should also be thinking about their families, right? And the impact on their families. So this is about the individual, the community, and the family. And what does it look like when reentry starts the moment they enter prisons, right? How are we building a deep bench in terms of partnerships? Like real talk, it is hard getting access to the jail. It is really hard. There's a lot of rules and regulations. There's background checks. You can't take this. The DC Rape Crisis Center, we used to run support groups in the DC jail. And I was the one who did the ones for the men and the women. And I had a male co-facilitator for the men. But it was like trying to get into the CIA because we had a lot of hoops to go through, right? And it was a lot of back and forth in terms of what supplies I could bring in, things like that. But I think one of the most powerful things I will ever remember is when the guard wanted to stay in the room that I was talking to the women in. And I said, no, I'm fine. Like, I'm fine. Like, we need to have some level of confidentiality. Now, with the men, I didn't win that battle, right? Even though I had a male co-facilitator, I didn't win that battle. And one of the men said to me, and I'll never forget this, he said, ma'am, how are we supposed to talk about consent when we got guards back there? When we have no power in jail, when we have no say-so over anything in jail? What does that look like in a jail setting? And a transformative time that we had. But I think part of this is, how do we recenter humanity, even though you are incarcerated? Right? You still have rights. You're still human, all of those things. So when we're meeting women and men at the hospital from the jail, my advocates are very clear, like, take the handcuffs off, right? Like, you be here, but take the handcuffs off, right? There are some doctors that have partnered with us at the hospital that says they won't do an exam if there are handcuffs on them. It's just inhumane. And so I think, it's hard, right? Because it's layered, it's complex, all of those things. But I think we first have to go back to the basics. Like, what is our why here?
Wow, that was extremely powerful. Thank you, Indira. And I absolutely love that you just lifted up the issue around folks being restrained during forensic sexual assault medical exams. And that is a conversation that we have quite a lot at JDI with advocates, with corrections officials, as we provide technical assistance around the country, that just because someone is incarcerated doesn't mean that they lose all of those rights to humanity and dignity, and that you as an advocate have to then defer, or as a nurse providing an exam, that you then have to defer to what that that corrections officer who's transporting that person is saying. Because many times they will say, like, oh yeah, leave the restraints on, or it'll just be presumed that that's what's going to happen. And part of the work, again, it's amazing when you talk about it, right? Anti-Blackness, anti-racism, anti-oppression can sound so lofty, but that is the work. Going into the room and saying, let's have a conversation here. Is this a situation in which there is a security concern that actually necessitates that this person have their restraints on? Even if they need to have the restraints on, do they need to be on both wrists? Do they need to be on wrists and ankles? Can they be on one and not the other, etc.? And those are conversations that actually start before you even get into the room. So all of that is movement work. I think we don't always recognize that, but that is basic human rights advocacy, because you start to set a precedent that then will help the next survivor and the next survivor and the next one after that. So thank you. So wanted to I've got another question here. I have a lot of questions today. In both the movement to end sexual abuse behind bars and the anti-racism and abolition movements, it is critical that we include the voices of incarcerated people of color. And we have touched on that a little bit already. But how can we do better? How can we do better at centering the margin, centering the voices of incarcerated people of color? Kai, do you want to take that one?
Yes, Cynthia would. So I think for me, the best way that we can work on this movement together and to push what it is that we want forward is to bring the survivors into the actual conversation. And the only way to do that is to, let's forget about all the huge textbook language and words that no one can understand. Let's bring the language to something that people can understand. Because one thing that I learned being incarcerated is that there are a lot of people that did not have the proper education. So they did not make it all the way through school for whatever reason. And a lot of those people, when you mention the word abolition or, just certain things that you would think people would know, and they're like, I don't know what that means. So instead of them running to, to get help or to speak out about things, they're in that fear of not really understanding what is being said to them. So we have to, at some point, let's not do that language with the people that we're supposed to help. And in order to help those individuals, we have to have conversations with them. Let's not assume that we know what it is a person needs. Let's ask questions. What is it that you need? What is it that we can do to help? What is it that you like to do to help push this movement forward? or that you feel is necessary to get you in a place to where you feel safe, where you can ask questions, where your rights are protected, and when they're not, you know the proper procedure and protocol. So that help, you know, for us to actually do that, we got to just each group of different people. You have to meet where they are. So if no matter where I am, I'm going to meet where they are, because I understand that there's a lot of people that have a way better education than myself. But when I'm in the rooms with those individuals, I'm still able to have a conversation with them and understand what is being said. Same as when I'm in a room with someone who has less education than me and don't really understand a lot of what's going on. But in order to get those individuals to that table, we have to speak in a way that they understand, make them feel welcome, and let them know they are welcome. Because a lot of them are afraid to speak up and talk, because I was at first. You know, I was like, I don't know what that means. What abolition? What is that? You know, that was my thing. Like, what is that? I didn't know what it meant. But until someone actually explained it to me in a way to where I understood it, and then I was like, you know what? I can actually do that. I want to be a part of that fight. That seems like something worthwhile. So until it got to that point for me, you know, I was just like, okay, well, they're talking about a lot of stuff I don't understand. And what is all these words they're using? Because to be completely honest, I had to actually use a dictionary to just look up some words, because I was like, you know, I know what this means, but what does it mean when you put it together like this? So, you know, it happens, but it's just us just bringing it down. Let's humanize with other people. Let's get to their level and try to understand and see where it is that they're coming from. That way we can help.
Thank you so much, Kai. Yeah, I just want to acknowledge that Kai is in Georgia. He has been, you know, his community has been impacted by the recent awful weather, Helene, and now we've got the other storm coming, the other hurricane. So, and Kai actually traveled from his home to a hotel and, you know, went through quite a lot of efforts to make sure that he would be in a place today where he would have good Wi-Fi, but it seems like we have just a little bit of technical difficulty there. But in any event, what you said was really important about language and about inclusivity, accessibility. Inclusivity might not even be the right word, right? It's about having a conversation that everybody can be part of. And so I want to ask Indira or Andrea, do either of you want to react to that? Because I think you guys are probably going to say it better than I can, the importance of doing this movement work in a way that folks who are directly impacted can take up the mantle and be at the center. They do have a real opportunity to be part of it, and barriers like language and things like that aren't keeping them out of it.
Well, I would just say, for the very reasons that as women, we decided that a gender analysis is absolutely necessary on these issues, and that we wanted to work on these issues from the perspective that we knew and understood as women. And it's really important for us to do our organizing, first of all, from the place of nobody's coming to save us. And we've got to do this amongst ourselves in our own neighborhoods. But what we discovered very early on, we received some real heavy backlash. Now, remember, we've been at this for some years now. We're going back to 2011, 2012, when we slowly started to come out. And we were, taken to task by men in the movement who felt that we should not be talking about free her. We should not be lifting up the issue of the liberation of women. And we unapologetically do. And we have stood our ground with that because we know the necessity of that. when you are organizing, which is, we're organizers, you know, we, and Kai is absolutely right. And, you know, like I said, we didn't know really the term abolition. And I want to just shout out Miriam Kaba again and Andrea Ritchie, who have given us the tools for study struggle, the tools for us to huddle and really work through these. Transformative justice, one of the most important critical tool books we ever received from Miriam Kaba. You know, and we kept asking her questions. She's like, let me tell you something, Andrea, don't call me again until you have tried it. And so early on, we just said, for our organizing purposes, we're gonna think and experiment and get on the ground and actually do. And what we very quickly began to understand is that when you're talking about lots of people, but we talk about women. When you talk about women in our neighborhoods, when we come back into our communities where all of our traumas and all of the issues took place, where, you know, whatever it was, the houses, the apartments, the people, they're still there. The residue of all of our trauma that landed us on the prison bunk, it's all still right there. We don't get to go off and live in other communities. You know, we come back home. And when that happens, so does everybody else. And if too often sisters were coming in to the space that we were trying to create in our neighborhoods and really inviting them in through participatory defense, transformative justice, basic income guarantee, you know, mutual aid, community pantries, all of the pieces of reimagining communities. And sitting at a table, and you look across that table, and there's somebody across that table, often a man, who has also been a part of your trauma and abuse, but does not want to address it, wants to pretend it doesn't happen. And then what we still find that we stand our ground on every single day, still coming into organizing spaces, is that still men predominantly lead those spaces and leave very little room for women to think and experiment and lead. And so we've got to do exactly what Kai is talking about. And for us, that piece isn't that difficult and challenging. Yes, we come in and use language that we are trying to introduce to other audiences, but in our own neighborhoods, in our own organizing spaces, you know, we're talking like we talked when we were on the prison bunk. We're identifying what the needs are, the individual needs of sisters. And I'm going to tell you something. You know, I was a lawyer. You know, I was very privileged in a lot of ways when I went to prison. I was not the poster woman of the women that were in that prison with me or of incarcerated women. But I'm going to tell you something. Some of the most brilliant, some of the most creative, some of the most resilient, some of the most courageous women I have ever met were in that prison. And that's who's in our prisons right now as we speak. And so as we organize and reach out to our sisters as they're coming home, and the prison gates, our work doesn't stop at the prison gates. The community for us as formerly incarcerated women are our sisters on the inside as well. So our community encompasses all of that. And yes, Indira, thank you for lifting up how damn hard it is to get into these prisons. They don't want us in there. How hard it is to send positive, reaffirming messages to our sisters inside. And that should not be. If this idea of prisons is so great and the answer to people causing harm, then you should want people to come in who will begin that shift for all of us. But for women, we do have to have that space to be able to exercise our brilliance, our ideas. what all the things that make up this broad definition of abolition, but maybe we don't use the term. We just say this is what needs to stop. This is what needs to happen. These are my ideas for getting it done, and let's figure out how to put one foot in front of the other to begin to move out to do that. So it's really important.
I think so. Thank you so much, Andrea, for sharing that. I think the other thing, just to piggyback off of that, is, I think there's a question that we all need to answer in society. They say that it takes a village to raise a child, but what does it take to heal an individual who has been incarcerated and their families, right? No one's having those conversations right now. There's massive hurricanes happening down south in Florida. And people don't realize that when you are in jail and prison, they don't evacuate. Florida's getting a category 6, not 5, category 6 storm. In every jail and prison in Florida, they are sheltering in place. They are not moving them, right? What does that say in terms of humanity when the mayor and the governor have come out and said these are life-threatening, that if you don't evacuate, you're going to die, right? So I think, I say that to say, because that's a trauma as far as I'm concerned. And I think when we are dealing with incarceration, we have to look at the complex trauma and the trauma, not just the sexual trauma, but the other traumas that happen to incarcerated survivors in jail. Like right now, hearing that there's a storm that could potentially cost them their lives and they can't do anything or they won't be moved, that's trauma. So I think, again, I think getting support in the jail, giving words of encouragement, all of those things are challenging. And, it has to be said, PREA is a problem. PREA is a huge problem. It's a hot mess. I hate to be the one to say it, and it needs to be reimagined because folks who are incarcerated and have been sexually assaulted, they don't have confidential spaces to talk to a counselor. They're lucky if they can get transported to a hospital, let alone pick up a phone. So I think we have to really think about PREA in terms of how it's operationalized in these jails, in prisons. And is it working? Because from what inmates tell us when we interact with them, it's not working.
Yeah, no, and Indira, this is a space for realness. So you just brought the real, right?
Can I just bring something else in there? Indira is moving us in a direction that I hoped we would get to. So we just worked, big shout out to California Coalition for Women Prisoners. The ACLU was a part of this, the National Council was a part of this, really pushing to get Dublin closed. But the way that it happened, Dublin is a federal prison, one of the 29 federal prisons. 19 of them, don't believe us, all 29 we know, but 19 of them, the Justice Department itself has released a scathing report of sexual abuse and rape of women. But Dublin is a glaring example of women, from the warden to the chaplain to the downline guards, who were raping women for years in the Dublin federal prison. And those women, an example of how PREA, how all these other things go out the window to shore up and to keep this notion of the need for prisons. Those women, some women like Michelle West, who was in that prison, had lived, she's doing triple life sentence plus 50 years, if you can imagine that dumbness. Had lived in that prison for 20 of the 32 years that she's been incarcerated. And overnight, they didn't even let her bring her property, and moved her with all of the women out of Dublin into other prisons. And they were told by the guards as they were leaving, and when they arrived at prisons like Waseca, like Hazleton, where they are already under investigation for their egregious levels of rape of women, they were told by the guards, don't try that shit here, it will not work. So women who have been victimized, raped, traumatized, separated from their families for decades, whose children have grown up without them, are shipped out overnight like chattel, moved to other prisons that are already under investigation for the same atrocities, and not even given the dignity to bring any property with them. And then the guards in Hazleton had the women jumped. So if you want to understand the control in women's prisons, that we're not all politicized, we're not all able to heal and to be in prison and to care about another woman in prison. Some of us are struggling through the same victimization and traumas that led us to the prison. And we've never had an opportunity to begin to work through that, to transform our lives. And so that happened to women who were sent to Hazleton. They were jumped, ordered by the guards of other incarcerated women who were still in a state of being under control by male guards at this new prison that also said to them, which was the going sentiment and the spread of words around the federal system when the women landed in the dark of the night from Dublin, don't try that shit because it won't work here. And some of them were further abused. So the reality of what we're talking about, we live in this every single day. We get the phone calls. We get the families. We get the hurt, the heartbreak, the trauma. We have lived it ourselves. We know what it's like for a God to grope us prior to sending us out to the visit room just to show the power he has when they know you're going to go see your husband. You're going to go out there and see your partner, your wife, your loved one. But they use that over us to make us feel small, to know that we would never share that because our families would lose their shit, lose their stuff, and we would lose all of our visits. All of these things that are compounded that we don't want to talk about because we just want to stay in this place of the necessity of such violent and traumatic and further harm causing places called jails and prisons.
Thank you, Andrea. I'm glad that you jumped in and said that. I do want to just explain that PREA is the Prison Rape Elimination Act for any of our listeners who may not know. And I don't have any problem with what you all have said. There are a lot of problems because we still live in a world where far too few incarcerated people get access to the services that they need, and sexual abuse is still far too rampant. And 25 years on for me, since I first got involved in this work, it is incredibly disheartening. And thank you for lifting up, Andrea, the reality that as much as we say that incarcerated people and, Black incarcerated people, survivors, need to be at the forefront of this movement, the truth of the matter is that when they do go to the forefront and voice, their rights and fight for their safety and say, hey, stop this, or this happened to me and I need help, or I need to be safe. Look what happens, right? And absolutely, the people who were moved from Dublin when Dublin was shut down, women were transported all over the country. It was horrendous and horrific, and the retaliation has been unceasing. Just kind of has taken so many different forms of what those people have been subjected to. So thank you for saying that. And so part of our job is to help, right? If folks are going to advocate, then the least that we can all do as allies to help them advocate for themselves is help to ensure that they can do that without retaliation. And that retaliation is addressed head on. So thank you. So we're at 2:54 Eastern. So I want to just give my colleague Susana Contreras, if she wants to jump in, and if there's a question, a burning question or anything, Susana. Otherwise, I'll be going shortly to our closing.
Sure, absolutely. So we do have time for, I think, 1 or 2 questions, but I just want to note that I will drop an email in the chat after this so that if folks have questions that are pending, you can feel free to reach our team. So this question is about PREA, since we've kind of bubbled that up. How do you leverage PREA, if at all, in the work that you do? And this is actually for you, Cynthia, and then maybe Indira, if you want to piggyback on this.
Yeah, so, as much as there is so much work to be done with respect to the implementation and meaningful compliance with PREA, PREA is also an incredible human rights tool, right? PREA gives us something to be able to go into conversations with corrections facilities. And believe you me, when I began working at JDI, not when I first started working on this issue, but when I started working at JDI in 2006, we would go into corrections facilities or prisons, jails, to put it more specifically. And the leadership in those prisons and jails would tell us, well, what are you talking about? That doesn't happen here, or we don't need to, to have this conversation. That's, and it was only, I won't say only, but largely, right, due to having the Prison Rape Elimination Act passed in 2003, then Attorney General Eric Holder adopting those standards, the PREA standards formally in 2013, I think it was, that we, for the first time, had a very tangible tool to say, you know what, these are the things that you need to do, and why are you not doing them? And here's how you do them. And you're going to be audited. You're going to need to be audited every 3 years. And there's some form of enforcement, at least for, it's harder with jails, but with state-run facilities, with respect to potential for loss of funding. So it gave us something to use, right? But I agree all day long that the work remains, and it's really hard for me personally when I see how much sexual abuse there continues to be, right? When we see the Dublins, when we see all of the DOJ investigations that are going on, when we hear from our Survivor Council members and other formerly and currently incarcerated people, we get about 2,000 letters a year from people who have suffered sexual abuse in detention. And so there are absolutely the moments of like, have we done anything? But I know we've made a difference, because we no longer live in that space where you have corrections officials saying, oh, it's not my problem. It wouldn't happen here, right? There is a sense of accountability that wasn't there before, but we've got to keep fighting, and we all have to keep fighting. The work is far from over. Unfortunately, I think as much as all of us at JDI would like to no longer have this job, we very much have to keep doing this work. And that's why we're doing this webinar, because we have to all work together, right? The abolitionists, the advocates, people like Indira, people like Kai with lived experience, we all have to kind of join together and collaboratively work in community. And only then can we come to a day where we don't need to have this conversation anymore. So, Susanna, I'm going to go ahead, if it's okay, and just kind of close us out. First of all, I want to say thank you so much, Andrea, Kai, Indira. You are all incredibly busy. There are so many other things that you could have been doing in this hour. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for having this conversation. I have just unending admiration for all of you and for the work that you do. Your work is so important, and we're just honored to have you all as partners. So we are going to drop the links for the DC Rape Crisis Center, for the National Council of formerly and currently incarcerated women and girls, information about Freedom Overground into the chat, where you guys can follow up, because we want to lift up these organizations and the incredible work that they're doing as well. And if there's, one more thing that I would want to remind everybody to remember about today's discussion, it is, as each of these panelists put so succinctly, that we have to listen to the voices of incarcerated survivors, and we have to listen to the voices of Black survivors, impacted people who are people of color. Those people need to be at the forefront. We talked about some really big and important topics today, but without the meaningful input of the people who are directly impacted by incarceration, by sexual abuse, we won't be able to make lasting change. And that's why JDI is committed to including currently and formerly incarcerated survivors at every level of our work. The problems that we've been discussing today can feel overwhelming, but we believe there is the ability and the hope for change. We can end sexual abuse behind bars, we can end mass incarceration, and when we confront these systems, we just need to do it in a way that addresses systemic racism. And we need everyone. We need the work of these amazing panelists, we need the support of all of you who are tuning in right now, and the voices of incarcerated people, and we have to help those incarcerated people to use their voices so that we don't have more Dublins. Thank you all for lifting up these voices and for joining us in this fight. Lastly, I want to remind you all that we have one more event in this series. It's on October 23rd. It's called Shut Them Down, Fighting the Immigration Detention Crisis. And that will be a conversation about the work to end the crisis of sexual abuse in immigration detention facilities in the United States. We're going to drop the link to register for that webinar in the chat. I hope you'll join us. Thank you all for tuning in and for your commitment to ending sexual abuse in detention. Thanks so much, everybody.